marriage contract lay open on the table, ink still glistening, when Lady Cordelia Winslow picked up the pen her father had set before her and did not sign it. She stood instead, the drawing room full of ivory silk and expectant silence around her, and said the one word that no daughter of the Winslow family had ever dared to say in 3 generations. No. The silence that followed was louder than any scream. Lord Percival Fairmont, the man to whom she had been promised since she was 12 years old, blinked at her as though she had struck him. Her father's face drained of color. Her mother's teacup rattled against its saucer, and somewhere near the fireplace, a thin, watchful man named Mr. Edmund Gray, her father's solicitor, though he seemed always to be lurking rather than working, allowed the faintest smile to touch the corner of his mouth. "You will reconsider," her father said, in the low voice he used when he wanted the servants not to hear. "I will not," Cordelia answered. "I would rather live in a cottage with nothing than in a mansion with a man I do not love, and who does not love me." By morning, she was gone from London. By evening, she had taken a room above the village bakery, in the small parish of Thornfield, 40 miles from everything she had ever known, with a single trunk, a small purse of coin, and a stubbornness that her mother had always called her greatest flaw, and her father had always called her mother's fault. She did not yet know that within the walls of that quiet village, in a crumbling cottage nobody wanted, lay a secret that would unravel her family's fortune, expose a betrayal 2 decades old, and force her to choose between the safety of anonymity and a truth that could either destroy her or save everyone she had left behind. If you enjoy stories of Regency romance, secrets, and scandal, subscribe to Noble Tales, because the truth buried in Thornfield is only beginning to stir. Thornfield was not a place built for a lady. Its single street was mud in the rain and dust in the sun. Its church bell cracked on every 3rd toll. Its residents regarded the arrival of a young woman traveling alone, with fine hands and an accent too polished for common use, with the particular suspicion that small villages reserve for anyone who might be running from something. Cordelia rented the room above the bakery from a widow named Mrs. Hargreave, a sharp-eyed woman who asked no questions in exchange for double the usual rate, and set about the business of disappearing. She told the village her name was Miss Cora Wynne. She let her fine gowns hang unworn in her trunk, and wore instead the plain wool dresses she purchased from the village seamstress. She learned to bake bread badly and mend stockings worse, and for the first time in her 22 years, no one called her my lady or reminded her of the marriage contract that, technically, still bore her father's signature and awaited only hers. She told herself she was free. She was not entirely honest with herself about how frightened she was. Word of the broken engagement had, of course, reached every drawing room in Mayfair within a day. The Winslow family's reputation, built over 3 generations of careful marriages and careful silence, cracked like the church bell. Lord Fairmont, humiliated before half the aristocracy, made no secret of his fury, and Cordelia's father, the Earl of Winslow, faced creditors he had quietly been managing for years, creditors who had only tolerated his debts because the Fairmont marriage promised to settle them. Cordelia did not know this. She knew only that she had refused a cage, and that the price of her freedom was distance. It was on her 3rd week in Thornfield, while walking the lane that ran along the edge of the old Hollowmere estate, a property so neglected that ivy had swallowed half its western wing, that she met the man who would change everything. He was standing in the overgrown garden with his coat sleeves rolled to the elbow, attempting, with visible frustration, to right an ancient wrought-iron gate that had fallen from its hinges. "You'll want to lift from the base," Cordelia said, before she could stop herself. "Not the top. You're only bending the hinge further." The man looked up. He was perhaps 30, with dark hair disordered from labor rather than fashion, and eyes the color of strong tea. He looked, she thought, like a man who had not slept properly in some time. "Forgive me," he said. "I did not expect instruction from a passing stranger." "Then you have clearly never met a woman who grew up watching gardeners argue about gates," Cordelia said. "May I?" He stepped back, amused despite himself. and watched as she directed him not touch the gate herself, for that would hardly have been proper even in her diminished circumstances, until it swung, creaking, back onto its hinge. "I am obliged to you, miss." "Wynne," she said. "Cora Wynne." "Mr. Julian Hale," he said, with a small bow that seemed unpracticed, as though bowing were a habit he had let go rusty. "I've recently taken possession of Hollowmere, or rather, I am attempting to determine whether it is worth possessing at all." She glanced past him at the crumbling house, its windows dark, its gardens drowning in weeds. "It has good bones," she said. "Whoever built it understood proportion, even if no one has understood upkeep in some time. You have an eye for architecture as well as ironwork." "I have an eye for many things I have no right to comment upon," she said, and something in her voice made him look at her more closely. "A woman of mysterious talents, in a village of bakers and blacksmiths," he said. "Thornfield does not often produce such surprises. Perhaps Thornfield has never properly looked." He smiled a real smile, startled out of him, and for a moment, the tired lines around his eyes eased. "Will you take tea, Miss Wynne? I confess Hollowmere has little to offer, beyond a rather good view, and a very bad kitchen. But I would value the company of someone who does not look at me as though I have already failed." She should have said no. A lady traveling under a false name did not take tea alone with strange gentlemen in half-ruined estates. But Cora Wynne was not entirely a lady anymore, and the freedom of that fact still felt new enough to be intoxicating. "I would like that," she said. Julian Hale, she learned over the following weeks, had inherited Hollowmere from a great-uncle he had scarcely known, a reclusive man named Josiah Hale, who had died the previous winter, leaving behind an estate mortgaged nearly to its rafters and a mountain of debts that made the property more curse than inheritance. "Everyone advises me to sell," Julian told her one afternoon, as they walked the estate's overgrown orchard, apples rotting sweetly underfoot. "The house is worth more as land than as a home, but there is something in me that will not let it go. My uncle wrote to me once, before he died, and said Hollowmere held something worth more than its debts. I assumed it was sentiment. Now I begin to wonder if he meant it literally, and I am simply too poor a detective to find whatever he meant." "What sort of something?" Cordelia asked, more curious than she meant to sound. "I do not know. He was not a man given to plain speech. The letter said only, 'The truth is where the roses used to grow. Do not let them dig without you present.'" Cordelia stopped walking. "Who is they?" I assumed he meant creditors, solicitors circling a dying man's property like crows. Julian shrugged, though the gesture did not quite hide his unease. "There is a solicitor, in fact, who has been remarkably insistent about surveying the eastern gardens. A Mr. Gray. He claims it is for a boundary dispute with the neighboring parish, but he has visited 3 times in as many months, and each time he seems less interested in boundaries than in digging." The name struck Cordelia like a dropped stone in still water. "Mr. Edmund Gray," she said slowly. "Thin man, gray eyes, a way of standing very still, as though he is always listening." Julian turned to her, startled. "You know him?" She had not meant to say anything true about herself in Thornfield. But the name had slipped free before she could stop it, and now Julian Hale was watching her with the particular attention of a man who has just noticed a door he had not known was there. "I knew a man by that description," she said carefully. "In London. He was—" "Connected to my family's affairs." "Your family's affairs," Julian repeated. "Miss Wynne, forgive me, but I have wondered for some weeks now whether Cora Wynne is entirely the whole of your name." Cordelia's heart beat hard against her ribs. She could lie. She had lied for 3 weeks without difficulty. But something about the honesty of his confusion, the plain, unguarded way he asked, rather than accused, made the lie feel suddenly unworthy of him. "It is not the whole of my name," she admitted. "But I would ask you not to press me further. Not yet." Julian studied her for a long moment, and she braced herself for suspicion, for withdrawal, for the coldness that discovery so often brought. Instead, he said only, "Then I shall wait until you are ready to tell me. But I will say this, Miss Wynne, or whoever you are, You are the first person in Thornfield who has looked at Hollowmere and seen anything but a ruin to be sold. I find I would rather trust that than demand a name." It was, Cordelia thought, the kindest thing anyone had said to her in a very long time. They did not speak of it again that day. Instead, they walked the boundary of Hollowmere's neglected grounds, and Julian told her, without prompting, of the life he had lived before the inheritance, a modest one, spent mostly in Bristol, where he had worked as a shipping clerk and never once imagined himself the master of anything larger than a rented room. His mother had died when he was young. His stepfather had been kind but unremarkable, a man of ledgers and quiet routine, and Julian had grown up believing his own history to be entirely ordinary. "And then a solicitor's letter arrived," he said, "informing me that a great uncle I had never met had left me a crumbling house and debts I could not hope to pay, on the condition that I at least attempt to save it before selling. I very nearly refused. I am not certain, some mornings, that refusing would not have been the wiser course." "Then I am glad you did not refuse," Cordelia said, and meant it more than she expected to. Over the following days, a rhythm settled between them that neither acknowledged aloud, but both quietly protected. She came to Hollowmere most afternoons, ostensibly to advise on the garden, though their conversations wandered further than roses into books they had both read, opinions they had never been permitted to voice at fashionable dinners, small honest disagreements that neither felt obliged to soften. Mrs. Hargreave at the bakery began to comment archly on how often Miss Wynne's boots came home muddied from the direction of Hollowmere, and Cordelia found she did not mind the teasing nearly so much as she once would have minded any gossip touching her name. It was, she admitted to herself late one evening, the first courtship, if it could even be called that yet, that had ever felt like a choice rather than an arrangement. The rose garden, when they finally found it beneath years of bramble and neglect, was smaller than either of them expected a square plot near the old carriage house, its beds long collapsed into wild tangles of thorn. They dug on a gray Tuesday afternoon, Julian in his shirt sleeves, and Cordelia with her borrowed gloves, both of them aware that what they were doing bordered on the absurd two adults digging in dirt on the strength of a dying man's cryptic letter. It was Cordelia's spade that struck the metal box first. It was not large, the size of a hat box, rusted nearly through, its lock long since seized with age. Julian pried it open with the edge of the spade, and inside, wrapped in oilcloth gone brittle and yellow, they found papers. Deeds, ledgers, and a letter, its wax seal still faintly legible, bearing the crest of a family Cordelia knew as well as her own reflection. The Winslow crest. Her hands went cold. "Julian," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name, "I need you to tell me everything you know about your great-uncle. Everything now." He looked at her, at the sudden white of her face, and did not ask why. He simply began to speak, and as he spoke, and as Cordelia read the papers with trembling hands, a story 20 years buried began, at last, to surface. Josiah Hale, it emerged, had once been a solicitor himself, junior partner to a firm that had, decades earlier, managed the affairs of the Winslow estate. And in that capacity, he had witnessed something he was never meant to see, the deliberate falsification of an inheritance. The ledgers told the story in dry, damning language. Cordelia's grandfather, the 4th Earl of Winslow, had possessed 2 children, not one, as the family had always claimed. A son, born of a first marriage to a woman who had died in childbirth, had been quietly disinherited and struck from all record when the Earl remarried into greater wealth. The boy had been sent away, his existence buried, his birthright folded into the inheritance of the half-siblings who came after. That son, had he lived, had he been acknowledged, would have been the rightful heir to nearly a third of the Winslow fortune, including the very estate on which Percival Fairmont's marriage settlement had been built. Cordelia read the account of it twice, then a third time, as though repetition might soften the shape of what it described. Her grandfather's first wife, a woman named Alice, had died delivering a son who lived a boy the household staff had apparently adored, if the surviving letters from a long-dismissed nursemaid were any indication. Within 2 years, the Earl had remarried, this time to a woman of considerably greater fortune and considerably less patience for a stepson who was not her own. The ledgers documented, in the flat, careful language of a solicitor's office, the quiet arrangements that followed. A sum paid to a distant cousin in Bristol to raise the boy under a different name, a series of annual payments that dwindled and then stopped altogether within a decade, and a final note, unsigned, indicating that the boy's existence had been resolved to the satisfaction of all parties, as though a living child were a debt to be balanced rather than a person to be loved. "Your father's fortune," Julian said slowly, understanding dawning with visible horror, "was never entirely his to promise. And Mr. Gray," Cordelia whispered, "has known it all along." The final paper in the box was the cruelest of all, a letter from Josiah Hale, written not to Julian, but clearly intended for whoever eventually found this box, explaining that he had kept the truth hidden out of cowardice for 2 decades, that he had watched Edmund Gray, then a young clerk, now a solicitor grown fat on secrets, use his knowledge of the disinheritance not to right the wrong, but to blackmail the Winslow family quietly for years, ensuring their debts, their marriages, their entire fragile fortune remained under his careful, invisible control. "I have been a coward," Josiah had written. "I could not undo the wrong done to that boy, wherever he is now, nor could I face the ruin of confessing what I knew. I leave this here, buried where it cannot easily be found, in the hope that someone braver than I will one day dig where I did not have the courage to dig myself." Cordelia sat back on her heels in the ruined garden, the paper trembling in her hands, and understood at last why her father's face had gone so pale the night she refused Lord Fairmont, not merely from wounded pride, but from fear. Fear that any scrutiny of the Winslow finances, any scandal that drew eyes toward the family's affairs, might finally expose the secret that Edmund Gray had been holding over them for 20 years. She had run from a marriage. She had run directly into the truth her father had spent a lifetime burying. For a long while neither of them spoke. The afternoon light slanted low across the ruined beds, catching the rust on the old box, the yellowed edges of the papers, the small, stubborn green shoots of bramble already reclaiming the earth they had disturbed. Cordelia thought of every dinner at which her father had grown suddenly quiet when the subject of the family's finances arose. Every occasion on which Edmund Gray had been present at gatherings that seemed to require no solicitor at all. Every small, unexplained deference her father had shown a man who was, by rights, merely an employee of the family. It had never once occurred to her to wonder why. "You are certain of the hand," Julian said at last, turning the disinheritance papers over carefully. "That this is your grandfather's own writing, not a forgery." "I have read enough of his correspondence to know it," Cordelia said. "He wrote to me twice a year until his death, always in that same cramped, impatient script, always signing his name as though he resented the time it cost him. This is his hand. I would stake anything on it." "Then we are no longer speculating," Julian said quietly. "We are accusing." "Yes," Cordelia said. "And I find, rather to my own surprise, that I am not frightened by the thought." She was frightened. She simply found that the fear no longer outweighed the anger, a slow, clarifying anger that had been building in her, she realized now, since long before she had ever set foot in Thornfield. Anger at a family that valued silence over honesty. Anger at a father who had let fear govern every choice he made for her. Anger, most of all, at a solicitor who had smiled at her across 100 dinner tables while quietly bleeding her family dry, and who had very nearly succeeded in marrying her off to secure his own continued silence. "We must go to London," Cordelia said, though the thought of returning, of facing her father, facing Fairmont, facing the ruin of the life she'd so carefully abandoned, made her stomach turn to ice. "We," Julian repeated, and something in the word seemed to please him, despite the gravity of the moment. "You would have me accompany you?" "I would have you understand," Cordelia said, "that if this is true, then Hollomere's debts are the very least of the wrongs done by Edmund Gray. There may be a man alive somewhere, my uncle, if he lives, who has been denied everything that was his by birth. And there is certainly a family, my family, who has been quietly extorted for 20 years by a man who smiles at our dinner table and calls himself our solicitor. Julian was quiet for a long moment, looking at the papers spread between them in the ruined rosebed. "There is something else," he said finally. "Something I did not tell you, because I did not think it mattered until now. My great-uncle's letter mentioned a name once. In an earlier correspondence, I did not fully understand. He called the disinherited boy young Thomas. I assumed it meant nothing to me, but my father's given name, Miss Winthe name, I was raised under before my mother remarried, and I took my stepfather's name of Hale, was Thomas." Cordelia stared at him. "You believe your father?" "I believe," Julian said slowly, as though testing the shape of the thought for the first time, "that my father may have been the very boy your grandfather cast aside, which would make Hollowmere not simply an inheritance from an eccentric great-uncle who pitied a poor relation, but the last remaining fragment of a fortune that was always meant to be mine, ours, whichever word applies now." The garden around them, wild and neglected, suddenly felt less like a ruin and more like the last honest place in England. They returned to London within the week, and Cordelia's arrival at her father's townhouse produced a scene that servants would whisper about for months. The Earl of Winslow, upon seeing his missing daughter standing in his study, not contrite, not broken, but flanked by a stranger and holding a box of 20-year-old papers, went the color of old parchment himself. "Cordelia, I know about Thomas," she said, before he could summon a single practiced denial. "I know what grandfather did. I know what Mr. Gray has known for 20 years, and what it has cost this family in silence and fear. I know why you were so desperate for the Fairmont match, that you would have sacrificed my happiness to protect a secret rotting at the heart of our fortune." Her father sat down heavily, as though his legs had simply stopped agreeing to hold him. "You do not understand what you have found," he said quietly. "Gray has held this over me since before you were born. He has bled this family for 2 decades, not openly, never openly, always in small, deniable ways. A favorable loan here, a silenced witness there. I told myself I was protecting the family name. I told myself Thomas was lost regardless, that the kindest thing was to let the past remain past. And instead, you let a blackmailer control every marriage, every debt, every decision this family has made for 20 years, Cordelia said. You let him nearly control mine." The days between Cordelia's return and the confrontation itself were among the strangest of her life. Her mother, informed at last of the truth her husband had carried alone for 2 decades, wept not for the loss of fortune, which proved smaller than feared, but for the boy who had once been part of the family and had been quietly erased from it, and for the years her husband had spent so afraid of a shadow that he had let it govern every decision in the household. Cordelia found she could not entirely forgive her father, not yet. But she found, too, that watching him finally speak the truth aloud, haltingly, at their own dinner table, was its own kind of beginning. Julian, for his part, retained a solicitor named Mr. Aldous Pruitt, a blunt, unfashionable man with no love for Edmund Gray and no patience for delicacy, who reviewed the ledgers within a day and pronounced them, in his own words, damning enough to end a career twice over, if presented correctly. It was Pruitt who advised against a public trial, not from any wish to protect Gray, but from a cold, practical calculation that a private reckoning, properly documented and properly threatened, would extract more restitution more quickly than the slow machinery of the courts. The confrontation with Edmund Gray came 3 days later, in the very drawing room where Cordelia had first refused Lord Fairmont, a symmetry she had not planned, but did not regret. Julian stood beside her, the box of papers between them on the very table where the marriage contract had once lain, and Cordelia's father, finally finding a courage 20 years too late, stood at her other side. Gray's composure did not break easily. He examined the papers with the same still, listening calculation he brought to everything, and when he finally spoke, his voice held no confession, only calculation. "These documents prove nothing that would survive a court," he said. "Aged ledgers, an old man's dying fancies. You have no witness, no living claimant. "I am the living claimant's son," Julian said quietly, "and I have spent the last 3 days retaining a solicitor of my own one, with no debts to hide and no fear of you. I would advise you to consider very carefully what a public trial would do to your reputation, Mr. Gray, compared to what a quiet, thorough restitution might do to preserve it." It was not triumph, exactly, that crossed Gray's face. It was the particular, deflating recognition of a man who has run a long con and finally met an audience that will not applaud. "You think this makes you righteous," Gray said, his composure fraying at last around the edges. 20 years, I have kept this family's secrets. 20 years I have ensured your father's comfort, your mother's standing, your own place in every ballroom that mattered. You would not have had a season to refuse a marriage in, Lady Cordelia, if I had not spent 2 decades quietly managing what your grandfather broke." "You did not manage it to protect us," Cordelia said. "You managed it to own us. There is a difference, Mr. Gray, though I suspect you have told yourself otherwise for so long that you have forgotten it." Gray said nothing further. He gathered his hat and his gloves with the same unhurried precision he brought to everything, and at the door he paused only once, looking back at Cordelia with an expression she could not entirely read, something between contempt and, unexpectedly, a thin thread of respect. "You were always the clever one," he said. "Your father should have listened to you years ago." Then he was gone, and the drawing room, for the first time in 20 years, belonged entirely to the family whose name it bore. The scandal that followed was smaller than London expected, and larger than the Winslow family had feared. Edmund Gray's practice collapsed within the month, his other clients quietly withdrawing as whispers of his methods spread through Mayfair's drawing rooms. He did not face criminal trial, the Winslow family, for all its newfound courage, still preferred a private settlement to a public one, but he faced something arguably worse, to a man who had built his entire life on being indispensable, irrelevance. The Winslow fortune, examined honestly for the first time in 20 years, proved to be neither the ruin Gray had threatened, nor the untouchable wealth the family had always claimed. A third of it, precisely as the ledgers had promised, was returned through careful, quiet legal arrangement to Julian Hale, as the rightful heir of the disinherited Thomas Winslow. Lord Fairmont, informed of the scandal, withdrew his interest in the Winslow family entirely, which Cordelia found she could not mourn even slightly. There were, inevitably, weeks of difficult reckoning that followed the quiet triumph of that afternoon. London society, ever hungry for spectacle, produced a fresh wave of gossip, some of it cruel, speculating that Cordelia had orchestrated the entire scandal to escape her engagement, some of it oddly admiring, casting her as a heroine who had uncovered a conspiracy through sheer nerve. Cordelia found she cared for neither version particularly. She had spent her whole life being discussed rather than heard, and the novelty of the attention wore off within a fortnight, leaving only the ordinary business of putting a fractured family back together. Her father, stripped at last of the secret that had governed him, proved a smaller and sadder man than she had expected, but also, in time, a more honest one. He wrote to the cousin in Bristol, who had once raised the boy called Thomas, seeking what record remained of that lost childhood, and though the answers were incomplete, Thomas himself had died some years before Julian's birth, a fact that settled over the family, with a grief no one had expected to feel for a man. None of them had known. The Earl insisted on establishing a proper account of what had been done, filed formally, acknowledged publicly among the family's papers, so that no future Winslow could ever again pretend the wrong had not occurred. It was, Cordelia thought, the smallest possible penance. But it was more honesty than her father had managed in 20 years, and she chose, carefully and not without effort, to let it be enough. She returned to Thornfield one final time, not as Cora Wynne, but as herself, Lady Cordelia Winslow, though she found she preferred, now, simply to be called Cordelia. Julian was in the rose garden when she arrived, no longer digging but planting new roses, she realized, replacing the wild bramble that had swallowed the old beds for 20 years. "I did not expect you to return," he said, though his smile suggested otherwise. "I find I have grown rather attached to a village that once thought I was hiding from a scandal," Cordelia said, when in truth I was walking directly toward one. "And are you sorry for it?" She considered the question honestly, considered the humiliation of that first refusal, the fear of exile, the strange freedom of anonymity, the terrible weight of the truth she had uncovered, and the particular, unlooked-for gift of a man who had asked no questions until she was ready to answer them. "No," she said, "I refused a marriage that would have made me small, and it led me here, to a truth that made an entire family honest for the first time in 20 years. I cannot regret that, whatever it cost." "Hollowmere is no longer quite the ruin it was," Julian said. "The roof is mended, the debts are settled. There is, I am told, even a rather good kitchen now, though I still cannot cook in it myself. Is this your roundabout way of asking me to stay, Mr. Hale?" "It is my roundabout way," he said, setting down his spade with the same seriousness he had once shown a broken gate, "of asking whether Lady Cordelia Winslow might consider becoming mistress of an estate that only exists today because she once stopped to tell a stranger he was lifting a gate incorrectly." Cordelia laughed a real laugh, unguarded, the kind she had not allowed herself in the drawing rooms of Mayfair. "I refused one marriage in a drawing room full of silk and candlelight," she said, "because it promised me nothing but a gilded cage. I find I am rather more inclined to accept one offered in a half-wild rose garden by a man who let me dig for the truth beside him, rather than keep it from me." The bell of Thornfield's small church rang, cracked and imperfect as ever, as she said yes. If this story of scandal, secrets, and a love that grew from the ruins of a 20-year lie moved you, subscribe to Noble Tales for more Regency tales of forbidden romance and hidden truths, and tell us in the comments, would you have had the courage to refuse the marriage, not knowing what the truth would cost you?